All right, good morning. Thank you again for watching us. I appreciate your time and effort to join into these videos. One day this will be over and we can actually have a Sunday school class, and that'll be a lot easier to teach than just me and Ben sitting in an empty church house. But again, thank you for your time. Today we'll be continuing our study of Daniel. We'll be in Daniel chapter 5. We're going to have yet again a story that we know, a story that we've heard growing up in children's church and in church our whole lives, and it's the writing on the wall. And we still, 3,000 years later, talk about we can see the writing on the wall, a phrase we will still use. We want to see that a lot of things factor into this, and we can go in a lot of different directions on getting some meaning and application out of this lesson for our daily lives. One would be, to be aware of our pride and how proudful we can be. There's an ancient heathen proverb that I like to quote, and it says, "Whom the gods would humble, they first make proud." We can find biblical truths very similar to that, worded slightly different. And we're going to see that today we have a man that is in power. He has great control. And, he has a party to celebrate himself. But as he's doing this, God's already has the plans and work for him to lose his kingdom. Now, keep in mind, civilizations and dynasties such as the Assyrian, the Babylonian, they don't rise and fall overnight. It takes a while for them to build, and it takes a while for them to decline, and then their ultimate destruction. That'll be true for these. We'll have, in a few weeks, we'll be introduced to a Persian leader that he'll be passed and conquered by Alexander the Great, which will give way later to the Romans, which will give way, and then we see how this progresses. So when we look at this, we shouldn't believe that God in one night brought down a civilization. He certainly has the ability to. But when God chooses to use man or physical things of the earth, it occurs over a natural process of time. And we're going to see that that's what's happening today, as we're having the Babylonian civilization to be conquered and taken over by the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, let's begin, and the title of our lesson is The Writing on the Wall. And our first little section is Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. God can use any means necessary to humble those who disregard Him. Now I'll begin reading in chapter 1 of verse 5 of Daniel. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Now, we're told this man's the king, but he's not really the king. He's more of the regent or co-regent. He's actually just in charge. His father's the king. He's kind of has his own interest. Belshazzar is in control due to that. And he says he has a great feast. And Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels from his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. Now, it's striking to me, first of all, he said his father Nebuchadnezzar. He's not a direct descendant, probably bloodline of Nebuchadnezzar. He probably is through maybe his mother or grandmother or something of that nature. We're not really too concerned about that. But that would be kind of like the Jews would say of the lineage of David. He was a child of David. He's going to try to show that line back to the king. But notice he says that they're having a good time. They're having this feast, and it's getting kind of wild. And he says, "Bring me the gold and silver instruments that were taken by my father, the first king of the Chaldeans, out of Jerusalem." Now, I've never thought about this, but why would that even cross his mind? Why would he even think about things of Jerusalem? Okay, the Bible doesn't really say. Now, we need to remember that the Bible is not written in a chronological order. This is not a diary written day by Daniel. Okay, the events of today are decades after the events that we studied last week of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. We're maybe 60 years later. So why would that even cross his mind? This young man probably wasn't even alive when Daniel and these first Hebrews were taken into captivity, when Jerusalem actually fell. Now, Jerusalem would be destroyed later. Remember, we talked about those 3 waves of destruction of Jerusalem. He might not have even been born in the latter ones. So why does that even come to mind? I think later in the story we'll see something that might shed a little light on that. There's not a direct correlation. It might not matter, but I'm just curious and I think about stuff. So let's move on. Verse 3. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, that which is in Jerusalem, to the king and the princes, and they drank in them. They drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold, and the silver, and the brass, and the iron, of wood, and of stone. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the king's palace, and the king saw the part that the hand wrote. Let me go ahead and get verse 6. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosened, and his knees smote one against another. So we have a great party. You can kind of think, and I think this would fit the narrative. I didn't do the history of it to find out roughly how old Belshazzar is at this time, but we're going to think that he's young enough that he's still kind of full of himself, and that this party is probably in his honor that he threw himself. And he's invited everybody that's everybody throughout the kingdom to be there in honor of him. And it's a display of who he is and how powerful he is and what kind of party he can throw. Now, we see that he brings those vessels, and then they drink out of those vessels that were reserved for God in the temple. Now, what had been happening with these vessels that were in the temple in Jerusalem? Had they just been in storage? Had they been in boxed crates? I don't know. The Bible really doesn't say. It just says bring them. So he had some thought of where they were at, or what they were at least. But he says bring them. And then they use them, and he drinks out of them. And then it says in that same hour we see a hand. And it's against the wall where the light's perfect, where everybody can see it. Now again, we talked about last week that these buildings they're in, these are not mud huts. Okay? These are nice, for the time, extravagant buildings. They're large. And there's a lot of people in here, and then there's a sign, there's a hand that's visible, and they can see that it's writing in the plaster. And you can see it, you can read it. Okay? Now, as you can imagine, this is concerning to Belshazzar, and he looks at that and it says his knees begin to knock. He's afraid. Okay? Now, remember last week we said that Nebuchadnezzar looked in that fiery furnace and he recognized that my gods can't do that, and I want to add Jehovah God into my lineup of gods. This man recognizes my gods don't do that. This is spectacular. This is miraculous. This is something that's never been recorded that I'm aware of, and I'm witnessing it. And it frightens him. It would have frightened me too. Let's move on. Let's look at verses 7 through 16. God uses his people to share his truth with the lost world. Verse 7. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, and the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now remember, he didn't offer half the kingdom or all the kingdom because it's not his to give. He's not the king, but he's acting in the stead of the king. So he offers what he has to offer. And what they did is they just brought in all the wisest people at his disposal. He said, bring in all the smart folks. And that's who they said they were. And then bring in the people that are mystic and think they're smart. Bring them in. And say that they can have the third of the kingdom if they can interpret what this means to me. Then came in all the king's wise men, and they could not read the writing nor make known the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now, we see that his countenance has already changed once, and he's frightened. what's going over him now? Now he's got something that is miraculous. He recognizes it's miraculous, and now he can't read it. So now he's frightened, plus he's confused and perplexed. He's in a bad place. Verse 10, Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts be troubled thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. And this queen, maybe his mom, maybe this is the queen regent. I'm not sure of the exact mechanism of how these people are connected here, but she said, what's wrong? Why is your countenance changed? Because it's visible. She hasn't been there. She comes into the banquet hall and says, this don't look like the kind of party that I was expecting to see. What's wrong? Because it's visible on his face. 11, there is a man in the kingdom in whom, and she says, there is a man in the kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say, thy father made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Forasmuch as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving the doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So she said, listen, you may not know this, but there was a man named Daniel. And Daniel's probably 80-ish at this time. He's not a spring chicken anymore. He's not that young man that was brought out of Jerusalem as an exile. He's an old man. And she says, listen, there's a man that in the past knew a lot. And he interpreted things. And said Nebuchadnezzar recognized he could do these things. And Nebuchadnezzar used him. I think you should too. Okay. Now, we get down to verse 13. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have heard of these. I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. Now, notice what the queen, how she described Daniel, said, the gods are with him. And then Belshazzar, when he approaches Daniel and he recognizes him, said, I've been told that the gods, remember these people are polytheistic, it means they worship a lot of gods. They have never converted to Judaism. They have never accepted Jehovah God as their Savior. They just want to include him in their lineup of gods. And he says, and she said, we understand that the gods are with you. That's as far as their understanding is. Verse 15. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of this thing. And I have heard of thee, and thou canst make interpretation and dissolve doubts. Now, if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretations thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt have the third of the rule in the kingdom. All right. So, he brings Daniel in. And notice he doesn't say, I know you can do it, Daniel. Notice what he said when Daniel first come in. He obviously had somebody whispering in his ear a little bit, and he said, Daniel, I understand that you're one of those exiles, one of those bond people that we brought out of Jerusalem when we conquered Jerusalem and Judea. And he kind of reminded Daniel of why Daniel was there. And it was probably an effort and a show of force, because remember, here's a king and he's brought in all of everybody that's everybody in Babylon, and now he's afraid, and his countenance has changed, has dropped. And it's a chance to show a little bluster talking to Daniel. Here's an old man, and he comes in and he said, now, remember, you're just a bondman here. We brought you here. We made you what you are, Daniel. Then he starts talking to him. Okay? 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another, yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. Now, so Daniel says, I don't want your stuff. Okay, you keep that, but I will read it and I will tell you what it means. You know what? Just reading it is not enough. All right? I can read poetry, but I have no idea what it's talking about. Okay? I can read the words, but I have to sit with a dictionary and a thesaurus to find the meaning. And by the time I do that, I'm not really impressed. Now, there were people, no doubt, that could read. It was plain, and no doubt it was large. There were people that could read it, but they could not interpret it. They couldn't tell what it meant. Verse 18, O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, and majesty, and glory, and honor. Notice who Daniel said gave that to Nebuchadnezzar. He said God gave it to him. All right? Daniel's going to spend a little time telling Belshazzar, saying, listen, you're where you're at because God put you there. And by extension of that, Daniel's saying, I'm where I'm at because God put me here. Okay? 18. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him, and whom would he slay, and whom he should be kept alive, and whom he should set up, and whom he would put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Now, we don't have time to talk about Nebuchadnezzar and what happened to him, but we're going to see that Daniel's pointing out, and Belshazzar would have known it. He said, listen, Belshazzar, he got lifted up with pride, and he thought he was equal and better than God, and God lowered him. He humbled him. 21. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was that with the wild asses. And they fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. And thou, his son, Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all of this. He said, remember Nebuchadnezzar? Remember, God allowed him to think and act like he was a cow. And he lived off the grass, and said the dew wet his back because he was out in the fields like the cattle. All right? And God did that to show him, Nebuchadnezzar, as powerful as you are, I put you there and I can remove you from there. And it said he was there until he realized God did this to me. God allowed me to have it, and God took it away from me. And when he realized that, God allowed him to have it back. And he said, Belshazzar and Daniel, and I think here Daniel's an old man. And he said, Belshazzar, you knew that. You were aware of it, and look where you're at. 23. But hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and thou hast brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords and thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and of gold and brass and iron and wood and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. So it finishes up and said, you did all this, and you worshipped all your many, many gods. And he said, but the true God you've not recognized. 24. Then was the part of the hand sent before him, and his writing was written. And this is the writing, and Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. How about that? That's the best I got. All right? This is the interpretation. The Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar that they clothe Daniel with scarlet, and he put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. And in that night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain. All right, so we had Daniel. Now let me go ahead and read 31. We'll finish out. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, we had a man that didn't know God, wasn't interested in knowing God. He was interested in where he was at and what he had. Okay? And God appeared to him with a hand writing. And he brought in somebody he probably didn't want to see. he brought in Daniel. I don't know if there was a connection between Daniel and Belshazzar. I don't know. I don't know how long Daniel had been retired. Okay? I don't know if Daniel was retired. I don't know what Daniel's role is at this point in time. But we see that when they brought those golden things, gold and silver vessels out of the temple, and they desecrated them, when they brought Daniel in, we see that Daniel kind of gets the warning right off the bat. I know who you are. Okay? And I know you're here just because you're an enslaved people group. And you were brought here by my forefathers. Okay? I'm going to make some assumptions here. They're not biblical. They're coming out of Jonathan, not the book of John, okay? You think maybe they crossed paths before? Maybe there had been some warnings here in the past. Maybe Daniel was that wise counselor still standing in the corner. Maybe Daniel had been there until Belshazzar took over, and Belshazzar said, you find somewhere for him to go. I don't want to hear from him anymore. Maybe when Daniel referred to, you knew all this about your father and you stayed this way anyway, Nebuchadnezzar, your ancestor, and you did this anyway, maybe that's not the first time Daniel had told him that. I don't know that. But there seems to have been a little history there. And it's quirky to me that those instruments of gold and silver would have been at the disposal of the Babylonians for that long, and that's the only time we see that they're mentioned being brought out. Maybe it was a rub at Daniel. Maybe it was a rub at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Maybe these people were still bold in their faith, and it annoyed him. Maybe he couldn't get rid of them, and he said, I'll just show them. This is important to them, and I'll do this. Whatever the case was, he brought those vessels, and the God that put him there showed him that he could take it away. We continue on, and we've got the last part I read, the sovereign God humbles the proud. We see what the writing was, and the writing said that your kingdom has been numbered and it's finished. Okay? Now, it says that night Belshazzar was killed. Okay? Keep in mind, Babylon is large. It's a large city. So maybe the fighting has been going on outside all the time, and maybe the people in the midst of the city, in the middle of the city, didn't even know it. We really don't know. There's a lot of history about how they might have broached the walls. Did they come under them? Did they divert the Euphrates River? I don't know. But we see that he's told that kingdom has been numbered and it's finished. And it says he's been weighed in the balance and found wanting. You know, that's those scales, those old-timey balances where you put here and the weights and you measure. And he says, you've been weighed and you've been found wanting. You come up short. Okay? And then he goes on and says, the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And it would happen that night. Okay? Daniel reads that, and it happens that night. God's judgment upon the prideful Belshazzar, it was passed and the sentence was carried out almost immediately. And it says that he was killed that night. And then we go on and we have Darius or Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. We'll talk more in the next couple of weeks about who that was. There's a lot of speculation about who that name is. That's probably not the Darius that Alexander the Great will conquer and take his kingdom from him, the Persian Empire. Maybe that's a common name at the time. Maybe that's just the general that took the city. We don't know. But we know that Belshazzar lost his life. And we can tell through this that Daniel's saying he lost his life because of his pride. He allowed himself to be full of himself. And he never recognized who God, Jehovah, was. Guys, there's a lot we can take out of this. None of us are probably ever going to be king. We're probably never going to see handwriting on the wall. But this is something we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of who the giver and sustainer of life is. We need to be aware of whom all these blessings flow from. We can work hard. We can do our part. And God can bless and give But we need to realize that all of that is a gift from Him. It's all a blessing from Him. We can't obtain it by ourselves. We don't deserve it. It's a gift from Him. Guys, thank you for watching. We will continue a couple more weekends in Daniel, and then we'll move on. But I do want to thank you again for watching. Thank you for your time and your effort. And again, I'm going to keep telling you until this is over, until we all know it. As a Christian, as a child of God, we win. We win. You have to know our Lord and Savior. But if you do, you're on the winning team. No matter what's going on the right and the left, no matter what's going on right now, we win. Guys, thank you. Have a great weekend.